We're absolutely delighted to welcome Julie Trebilcock, Dr. Julie Trebilcock from Brunel University, and Dr. Liz Riley from Betknowmore, who are gambling harms treatment and support service. And Julie and Liz are going to talk us through a large qualitative study that they've recently completed on gambling harms among people on probation in England and Wales. And I think it's, as many of you will know, Julie and Liz, but they really are leading the way on this very important issue of gambling and the criminal justice system. And it's, I think, building on previous work that they did for the Howard League, which looked at women gambling and crime, which Julie and Liz presented at a hub webinar back in May 2023, which we held jointly with Bristol School for Policy Studies. So lovely to have you both back.
Well, thank you, Sharon, for the kind introduction and for the invitation for Liz and I to present our research, which, as you see from the slide, is around gambling and probation work in England and Wales. And I'm sure I go for both Liz and I just to extend a thanks to the Bristol Hub for Gambling Harms as well before we start, who very generously funded the research and have provided some fantastic support throughout. So thank you to you all for that. So in terms of what Liz and I want to take you through or to talk you through today, I'm going to just start by giving some kind of brief background and context to the research, what we set out to do, what we promised the Bristol Hub that we would try and achieve, and some of the kind of background and I suppose more general contextual information, particularly around probation. I'm mindful that some attendees may be working across HMPPS, but many of you may not. So I'll just set out briefly what we set out to do and how we went about doing that. And then Liz will spend some time talking through some of the kind of key findings of the study. And I'll then kind of finish with some of the implications and our recommendations for further work. So in terms of our research aims, our starting point really was a very, very limited evidence base in relation to probation and gambling. And certainly when we put through the funding application, we were not aware of any research exclusively looking at probation and gambling harms, either within England and Wales or, for that matter, in an international context. So our kind of first aim was really just to develop the very limited evidence base around probation and gambling harms. And with that came a sort of almost unwieldy set of questions, really, about, well, what does gambling look like in this space? How are people gambling? What harms might they experience? What gambling are probation staff seeing or coming across in their work? And I suppose linked to that is about then what does or what can be achieved in terms of probation work with people who are subject to probation supervision, of which I'll say a little bit more on in a minute. We also wanted to understand a bit more broadly about how gambling and gambling related harms may be linked to offending. And one of the key ambitions, and I'll say a bit more on this in a couple of slides, was to really explore how probation may or may not respond to gambling harms at a number of different points of probation work. So everywhere from pre-sentencing stage in the courts all the way through to supervision within the community. So just a couple of very brief background slides in relation to the literature, some of which I've alluded to already. I think it's fair to say there is a growing evidence base around some of the links between gambling and crime. And there's been some really quite important research that's been done, particularly in England and Wales, I think, in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, that tries to explore in more detail some of the complex links between gambling and crime. And I certainly think that the reference at the top here that we've given from Banks and Moore is helpful for reminding us that, of course, the link is very kind of complex, but also very different. So we see that Banks and Moore identify 3 perhaps different ways that gambling and crime may be linked, where it's coincidental and there's no direct link, where it's co-symptomatic, where crime and or gambling may be symptomatic of other factors, and then instrumental, which is perhaps where most of the research has been developed, where there is seen to be or thought to be a clearer causal link between gambling and crime. There is a growing body of research that links gambling particularly to financial crime, particularly things like fraud and theft, some forms of robbery. But there have been increasing amounts of research that are also now, I think, drawing our attention to other forms of financial and or violent crime where gambling may be potentially co-symptomatic or instrumental. And I think we really wanted to try and explore where that occurs in the work that we were doing as well. Couple of very brief background points in relation to probation services. Again, just mindful that some people may or may not be familiar with His Majesty's probation and prison and probation services in England and Wales. There are 12 probation regions across England and Wales, broadly across the country, the two countries, and probation staff within each of those regions will undertake a variety of roles. They're most commonly based within the community, but they are often then overseeing people with either a community order, so that is a sentence from the criminal courts of punishment ultimately within the community, a suspended prison sentence, which is where the prison sentence has been suspended and then people are held in the community, but importantly also for those who are on licence following release from prison. People released from prison have a statutory period of supervision by probation services in the community. The third point here just highlights that the caseload of probation is considerably higher than the number of people held in prison. So there are a high number of people under probation supervision at any time across England and Wales. And as I've mentioned already, probation staff are holding a range of different roles, sometimes based within the criminal courts, within prisons, and then a wide variety of other specialist teams. Just a final point to highlight here is just that they work closely with what are named commissioned rehabilitation services. This is important for our research because often it's these services that may engage with what we might describe broadly as probation work. So a range of different services relating to accommodation, employment, finances, dependency recovery, and more broadly around emotional well-being. Just a couple of points again, just in terms of the links now more specifically between gambling and probation, people on probation, which is the acronym there, POP. There's been a limited but a slightly growing amount of research that's been undertaken with incarcerated populations, people who are in prison in relation to either their gambling behaviour or the harms that they may experience. As I mentioned at the start, there's been there's nothing, very limited information or research that's been undertaken with people on probation. So that was really our ambition, was to just try and start scratching the surface and understanding this in a lot more detail. A recent report by Sarah Page from the University of Staffordshire did survey people on probation in the community as well as people in prison, and highlights quite a staggering figure that, up to 41% of people are gambling regularly, with more than a quarter of people on probation indicating that gambling could have a negative impact on their daily lives. Some similar figures, or slightly lower figures, but nevertheless some important figures in relation to people in prison from the Forward Trust, and an important report that was published in 2023 as part of that broader work by the Howard League, looking at gambling within prisons and highlighting that actually there's not only quite considerable prevalence, but also significant harms that follow from gambling within prisons. A couple of final kind of general points in terms of what the literature tells us. It's fairly consistent across any of the research that I'm aware of, that most research is concluding that there's still a need for greater awareness about gambling behaviours and gambling harms amongst prison and probation staff, and more widely across criminal justice staff. And while, as the final point highlights, there is some attempt and certainly some pockets of good practice where people are being referred to appropriate services, as page 2021 reminds us, knowledge and practice are thought to be quite variable. Okay, so just last slide from me before I hand over to Liz, just a little bit more about our research methodology. As Sharon mentioned at the start, it was a large qualitative study. We had essentially 3 groups, but as I'm sure many people on the call will expect, there's inevitable overlap between these 3 groups. Sometimes it was very difficult to clearly put people in one box, and something I avoid trying to do in any case. But broadly speaking, we tried to speak to people on probation. So that was people obviously subject to either a community order or in the community under supervision following release from prison. A small number of affected others, which of course are people that are affected by the gambling of other people close to them. In the case of our sample, this was exclusively their partners. We spoke to a small number of affected others about their experiences as their partner went through criminal justice and explicitly probation services. And then we spoke to a large number of HMPPS, that's His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, and probation staff about their experiences of working with people who may have gambling harms. And finally, a group of key stakeholders. The research was undertaken across England and Wales. We initially applied to 3 of those 12 probation regions, but during the lifetime of the study actually extended it to all regions in order to pick up various participants that were coming to us and saying, look, we want to talk to you about our experiences. We were very fortunate and very delighted to be guided and supported by our lived experience advisory group. This was a group of 7 men and women who importantly had experience of both gambling harms, but also of the criminal justice system and importantly of probation contact. So they were people that could really talk to the sort of 2 core components of what we were trying to look at. In total, which is partly why it took some considerable time to work through some of the data here, we spoke to a total of 85 participants, most commonly through online interviews using Teams, but we also undertook a number of focus groups with kind of key parties in order to explore some of these issues a bit further. The final point here is just around our thematic analysis, which we were again very grateful to our lived experience advisory group to meet with and discuss through and to sort of gain some of their insights and reflections as we started to try and get hold of all of that data. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Liz, who can take you through some of the key findings, of which I think there are many.
Thank you, Julie. So I have the unenviable task of trying to condense over 60 pages of research findings into just a few slides and a few minutes. And we've organised the findings around a kind of typical, in inverted commas, journey through the criminal justice system. So starting with the court and then looking at custody and then the community. And the bulk of our findings indeed relate to the community, which is where most probation work occurs. So just quickly looking at that court setting, most probation work within the courts, either magistrates or criminal courts, focuses on that pre-sentence report, which is a report that serves the purpose of informing sentencing decisions within the court. We found amongst our lived experience sample that there were really inconsistent experiences of pre-sentence reports. For some people, they were done fully with considerable amount of time spent with the court staff, and they felt that the staff really tried to dig into the root causes of their particular offence and try and understand how gambling harms had contributed to it. For other people, they had no knowledge of whether or not a pre-sentence report was even done. They didn't know what one was. And for other people, they knew that a report had been done, but it felt very much like a kind of tick box exercise. And indeed, court probation staff that we spoke to said that they felt that they had little time in which to actually complete full pre-sentence reports. Often it's now oral on-the-day reports. A reflection of the pressure that the courts are currently under. So while some defendants at this stage felt that the probation court staff really tried to understand the gambling harms they were experiencing. For others, gambling was not even discussed, even when it was linked clearly to their index offence. And they had a perception that staff weren't really interested in what had led to their offending. The pre-sentence report forms themselves do not easily capture gambling harms. There's no direct question there, although that is different in the Welsh courts, where there is a self-assessment questionnaire which does actually ask about gambling harms. When gambling was discussed within that court setting, staff had inconsistent understandings of gambling harms and their links with offending. Some of the people on probation that we spoke to felt that they were being kind of stereotyped as greedy, and that their gambling was entirely about money, and that they felt that the court staff thought that they should have and could have just stopped gambling. Staff that we spoke to acknowledged that they had had little training on gambling harms, and that they didn't feel confident discussing them with defendants, as well as having little time in which to actually have such discussions. Where gambling harms had been discussed, court staff were sometimes unsure as how to present those to the court. Would they be a mitigating factor or not? And indeed, even though sometimes they have that awareness of the gambling harms, it didn't really appear in the pre-sentence report, and instead they would opt to talk about the defendant's poor mental health, because they knew that that would be considered as a mitigating factor. Gambling was also not a focus at this stage because of the absence of a gambling specific treatment requirement that a court can order with commission support services in place, unlike people who are experiencing problems with drugs and alcohol. Court staff also did not really signpost or refer any defendants to support at this stage. And many of the people with lived experience that we spoke to had experienced really quite lengthy delays while waiting for court hearings and trials, which sometimes exacerbated the harms that they were experiencing, whether that was mental health or financial problems or relationship problems. Sentencing experiences were also really inconsistent. Some of our lived experience sample were given community orders. One person for a first offence was given a custodial sentence, and then for a second offence, a community order. Some were given very lengthy prison sentences. One person was not given bail, and therefore their access to support in an NHS clinic had to be stopped. Most of our sample found court to be a scary and alien place, with little idea of what was going on, who was who, how to behave, how to present themselves. Most of them did decide to present themselves as kind of honest, upstanding citizens who had kind of fallen foul of their addiction and committed an offence. And I'm just going to briefly read a quote from somebody who we have called Lily. "I was just trying to show that I wasn't some terrible criminal, and my kids were well looked after, and that I had my shit together." So most of our lived experience sample was shocked when they sometimes got very lengthy custodial sentences. Some of them also received Proceeds of Crime Act orders, or POCAs, as well as fines and compensation orders, with the court not recognising that all the money had actually been gambled away and it was now with the gambling operators, or indeed that POCAs and compensation orders can have long-term consequences for defendants and for their families too. Could you shift to the next slide, please, Julie? So looking at custody, over half of our lived experience sample were given custodial sentences. And as Julie mentioned before, prisons, especially amongst the male estate, have strong gambling cultures, and this was sometimes a serious challenge to some of our sample who were in recovery and trying to maintain the recovery. When somebody enters prison, they are given an they're given an assessment by the offender assessment system, or OASIS as it's known, which captures their risks and support needs. However, nowhere in OASIS is there somewhere which is clearly designed to capture gambling harms. There is just a finance question in the self-assessment questionnaire part of OASIS. And after that initial assessment, which usually fails to capture any gambling harms, there are also no further systematic opportunities or requirements to identify such harms. Prison offender managers who are part of the probation service were reported by our lived experience sample to rarely ask about gambling harms, or indeed to have much understanding of them. Indeed, most of our lived experience sample didn't even know that their prison offender manager actually belonged to the probation service. And some of them had very few interactions with their offender manager. It's also hard for people in custody to disclose gambling harms voluntarily. They don't know who to trust. They feel that they could be making themselves vulnerable if they do disclose gambling harms, vulnerable to exploitation or to violence. They were reluctant to be seen to be talking to prison staff. Sentence planning for people who are in custody, which is informed by OASIS assessments, was reported to rarely mention gambling support needs, and also release on temporary license conditions were also rarely considered, how to use those conditions to help people avoid gambling venues when they're out on license. There was also no support in place in custodial settings for gambling harms. Instead, where people in custody did get support, that tended to focus on things such as anger management courses, financial management courses, or accessing substance misuse services within those custodial environments. The stakeholders that we spoke to saw prison as a lost opportunity for addressing gambling harms, and indeed an environment where those harms could be made worse. And a quick quote from Jack: "It's probably the worst thing in prison is gambling. I'm literally still paying my mates from gambling in the cell with them." And this was after Jack was actually released. There was also finally a lack of through-the-gate support for those with gambling harms. The home checks that are conducted did not assess risk to recovery and potential gambling-related reoffending. There was no signposting or referrals done. Next slide, please, Julie. So, apologies for whipping through all this. I really encourage you to go and have a look at our report in full. I think the link is in the chat. So looking at the community side of things, conditions and restrictions can be attached by the courts and by probation to community orders, home detention, curfews and tags and licence conditions. And there are also rehabilitation requirements, all of which can be used to reduce the risk to the community. But we found very little evidence in our research of any of these being used to reduce the risk of gambling-related reoffending, or indeed to increase access to recovery support. Tags, for example, were problematic for some of the people we interviewed who were on probation. It caused barriers to them accessing and maintaining work. They put considerable strain on family life. And the tagging process itself, which is outsourced to private companies, was often seen as degrading. People on probation who we interviewed were embarrassed by their tags. This sometimes led to social isolation and boredom, with risks to them returning to gambling online in the home. Those released from prison on licence rarely had any conditions in place to prevent them from returning to gambling, or these just focused on them avoiding high street gambling premises when obviously they could still gamble online. Some people felt that such licence conditions would have been helpful to help them resist gambling, but for other people, they thought that it would just set them up to fail, and you cannot actually mandate recovery. Rehabilitation activity requirements, or RARs as they're known, were sometimes given to our sample, but given the absence of commissioned support services for gambling, they were rarely related to gambling support needs. Overall, contact between our lived experience sample and community probation staff was inconsistent. Some were lucky enough to get really interested community offender managers who spent time with them, showed curiosity, they built rapport, and indeed they even seemed to enjoy spending time with them because they were, low risk compared to the rest of their caseload. For most of the people on probation that we interviewed, however, they had little time with their community offender manager, and indeed that contact diminished really quickly over time. They felt that community staff saw them as having their act together, of being organised, of having organised their own support, and therefore in need of little support from probation. And staff acknowledged that most of their focus is indeed on managing their high-risk people on probation, high caseloads due to understaffing, and also dealing with changes elsewhere in the criminal justice system that are having really profound implications on probation. Next slide, please, Julie. Affected others also acknowledged or also said that they had virtually no support with probation services at all. And there was an assumption, if there was any contact, that especially female intimate partners would be the main source of support for the person on probation. Some affected others that we spoke to went to considerable lengths to contact community probation staff, but this had few tangible benefits for people on probation. Looking very quickly at training on gambling harms for community staff. This is changing now, albeit in a piecemeal fashion, but there is no mandatory training in place, and little voluntary training had been accessed by the staff that we spoke to. As a result, there were low levels of gambling harm understanding among staff. Gambling harms, for example, was sometimes perceived as being purely financial, and the offences that resulted as being just financial. Some staff had a deeper knowledge of gambling harms, but this was held very much at an individual level because of either their own lived experience or because of caseload experiences. That level of knowledge was not held within the system. But there are pockets of good practice, but they also speak to some of the regional inconsistencies that we found. Staff in approved premises which house people on probation had some good understandings of vulnerabilities to gambling harms amongst their residents. Their residents. For example, they acknowledged that approved premises can often be in locations that are deprived or seaside locations where there are lots of opportunities to gamble. There can be a shift from drug and alcohol use to gambling because gambling is not a monitored activity, and they're also aware that some of the gambling debts among their residents could pose serious risks to their resettlement in the community. Final slide, please, Julie, for me. So overall, few probation practitioners in the community asked about gambling harms, except when they were obviously linked to the main offence. Many of them felt that they didn't have the skills or the confidence or the time to ask about gambling. And people on probation identified barriers to disclosing gambling harms, such as the judgment that they would get. They would feel stigmatized. They also felt there was no point disclosing because there were no services or support available to them. Some of them just wanted to get on with their lives and have as little contact with probation as possible. Some of them had no trust in their community offender manager because they'd spent very little time with them. Others really did want that support, but they felt that they got very little. Staff also didn't have much knowledge of third sector or NHS support that is available in the community for gambling harms. And as I've said before, there are no commission services currently in place. The support that was given to people on probation was mostly centred on finances, mental health, or drug and alcohol use. Consequences for people on probation and their families of the lack of support included relapse, reoffending, poor mental health, including suicide ideation and attempts, and relationship breakdown. And I'm just going to finish with one quote from a senior probation officer. If there's something that's really impacting on someone's life and we don't know about it, we can't help them to address it. And if we can't help them to address it, then how are we going to address their reoffending or the harm that they're causing to other people? We can't. It's hidden. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So I've just got, in many respects, I suppose, a summary slide, really. We, in our report, include a chapter where we try and address what we've described as the kind of cross-cutting themes. Liz and I felt strongly that there were a number of themes that cut across all of these different areas of probation work, which can be quite distinct, but notably there were also some important common themes that cut across our work. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just kind of running through our overarching cross-cutting themes, picking up on many of the points that Liz has highlighted, and then just take you through some of our recommendations. In the interest of time, we've just picked out some of the main ones. So just starting with the cross-cutting themes, we used in our report this kind of concept or notion of atypical people on probation, which Liz has spent some time talking through. In some respects, this did reflect some of our sample certainly being perhaps more skewed to people who had gambled where their gambling was very, very clearly linked to their offence. But as Liz highlighted, many of these individuals really had no contact, often absolutely no contact with the criminal justice system. So this was a very unfamiliar and actually very challenging and quite intimidating and quite scary kind of experience for many people to be going through. But as Liz highlighted, often because they were seen as being relatively low risk and relatively compliant, often people did find that they certainly felt that they were left to their own devices without perhaps having some of the support and the knowledge that they might have liked to have had in order to navigate that system. So there was on the one hand a kind of assumption that they were low risk, but at the same time an assumption that they kind of knew what was going on and they knew how to navigate the system, which many of them highlighted that they just didn't. Now we are aware that there were, of course, going back to Banks and Moore's work around the different links between gambling and crime, there will be many more people, and there's still more people for us, I think, as researchers to try and hear from and understand from, where those links are more coincidental or perhaps even unrelated. And I do have concerns about how gambling, given the experiences of those where there is a clear link between gambling and crime, how do people, justice involved people, experience services when the link perhaps is not quite so obvious and as clear as it was for many of our sample. I think Liz has highlighted across the different areas of probation work that many people had, or people did have, a very inconsistent and sometimes mixed experience from practitioners. And this led to, and I think increased people's anxieties around disclosure and around asking for support, and ultimately knowing how to navigate that system that, as I've said, for many of them was unfamiliar. There's an overwhelming lack of data at all of these different points, and while there is clearer attempts to try and embed and start to ask questions and embed things like screening, there is still a real challenge in terms of accessing the data, and then linked to that, then being able to actually commission services that might then be able to address the gambling harms that we know are present within probation services. The fourth point here around lack of conversations around gambling, again, Liz alludes to much of this in the different parts of probation work, but there was a real sense of a resistance, I think, amongst some probation staff about asking about gambling, in part because it was seen as perhaps being quite normalised, or sometimes staff would talk about how it was almost none of their business, but they would ask about other areas of their lives. But also, I think, an anxiety about not knowing where to signpost them. So it was almost like practitioners didn't necessarily want to have the conversation because they didn't then know what to do if it had come up in discussion. And similarly, there was a wide range of reasons why people weren't always comfortable to disclose gambling, but people were also anticipating that there might be a lack of support or services that will follow, or that they were going to have to just keep repeating their story again and again and again and not perhaps getting the support they need. So I think we've probably addressed in that sense the perception, certainly from lived experience, but acknowledgement also by probation staff that there was often a lack of support available to people. I think increasingly there is actually an increasing range of support that can be available to justice involved people, but sometimes there was a lack of understanding about where these support services lay and across different agencies. So not only amongst probation staff, but perhaps amongst commissioned rehabilitation services, knowing where to signpost people and knowing where the clear pathways could exist. Liz has highlighted a lot of consequences, not only for people on probation, but importantly also for their families. In the majority case within our sample, this was female partners who were often doing a lot of the support for assistance with their partners. Just two final points to mention, and they're big ones, so apologies for kind of flicking over them, but we absolutely recognise through speaking to staff, and in fact people with lived experience recognise themselves, that probation are going through considerable challenges in terms of understaffing, high caseloads, and a whole range of other issues that really impact on their ability and capacity to be able to meaningfully engage in this space. And as you'll see from the title of our report and presentation, we did feel sadly that meant that gambling harms were treated as a low priority, not out of necessarily any feeling that they were a low priority, but just about the other many issues that probation staff are having to address. In the report, we have several pages of recommendations. I might perhaps just end with some of our general ones, and perhaps we can take some more in relation to questions. We also provide a series of recommendations in relation to the different points and also in relation to research. We felt quite strongly that a clearer national strategy, this is something that's been called for before across the justice system, is required so that we can increase awareness and develop better and more consistent approaches across both prison and probation services in England and Wales. We need greater recognition and awareness across not only prisons and probation, but also a wide range of other services that are working closely with the justice system. We feel that staff many times need, and this is linked to training, perhaps some more confidence around how to ask people on probation how they may be experiencing gambling and gambling harms. And then linked to that, of course, is the need for far better screening in relation to gambling harms. The final slide from me, we break down some of the different places and ways in which this needs to happen. Perhaps just pull out some of the headlines here. Screening, in our view, needs to take place in multiple locations at multiple opportunities. So it's not change that just needs to happen in one system in one place. We need to be much more actively finding out about gambling at the different points that we may come across people with gambling harms, so that we don't, to reflect back on one of the points Liz made, so that we don't have really a lost opportunity to provide people with better support while they are under the care of the justice system. I think I will conclude there in favour of perhaps opening up for questions. But yeah, thank you very much. And I hope we can make the slides available so that there's further detail for everyone.
Thank you so much, Julie and Liz. That's, yeah, really, really interesting run through your findings. And I know the report's available as well. So if you're happy for us to share your slides afterwards, I think that'd be great. I'm going to hand over to Vanessa to take us through the Q&A. We've got some great questions in there already. And just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can pop it into the Q&A box.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and also Liz and Julie. That was absolutely fascinating talk. And one of the first questions actually is about the slides in the report, and that's very kindly answered by Julie, that the slides can be shared. We did put the report in the chat, but we can also forward that to anybody who requires it as well. So the first question is, do you have a mechanism to share this with the Home Office and Department of Health and Social Care, or OHID, to ensure the findings can inform policy?
So that's Liz, unless you want to jump in. So we have thus far shared it with HMPPS. We've got good links and colleagues, particularly in Wales, although that is broadening out across the different probation regions, who are really trying to steer through in a much more kind of national sense some clear agenda in relation to gambling. So we've certainly circulated that to our colleagues there, and we're in discussions with trying to deliver similar presentations and potentially training around some of that. We're also required as part of our ethical approvals to submit the report to the National Research Committee for HMPPS. So that has gone off, and in fact they then wanted to know whether this would be open to HMPPS staff. But I think that question is really, really important, because of course that neglects some of those other really, really key agencies in terms of Home Office and Department of Health and so on. So we certainly will be trying to do that if there are any people that want to help us do that. And I think the more doors we knock on and the more people we can engage with this, the better. So certainly if there are any suggestions about people that would value and would be interested in the report, we'd be really open to opening those discussions as well.
Thank you. The next question is for both of you, Julie and Liz. If you could prioritise one change, where would it be? Perhaps the process around custodial sentences, and also the questioner is interested in your ideas about how to capture prevalence and the numbers.
It's so hard to come up with one, I think. There are so many points throughout and given the complexity of the three areas where probation work occurs as well, it is really hard to come up with one. What shall I plumb for? I think I will go fairly specific, which is the absence of gambling support services within prisons. It may not have the biggest impact overall in terms of addressing gambling harms within the criminal justice system, but just in terms of getting support to people who are in that very challenging environment, I think setting up gambling support services within prisons would be impactful. I mean, they do exist in places. Gamblers Anonymous goes into some prisons and provides groups, but just having that systematic support there and commission support services within custodial environments, I think would be really helpful.
Just going to follow on from Liz's answer there. I mean, in terms of piggybacking, I will give a different answer, but I think, you know, as I think one of the quotes that Liz gave from one of our participants, Jack, it was incredibly challenging to sit in probation offices and hear from people whose offence may have been unrelated to gambling, but who had then developed problems with gambling or challenges with gambling while in a custodial environment, and then were now in the community under supervision with all of the related challenges involved with employment and housing and so on, but also with the gambling accrued debt that they had occurred while in prison. So I do agree with Liz. I think that absolutely has to be a priority. I suppose linking it to the second part of that question, I think one of the priorities probably is about data, and it is about really trying to capture the levels of harm that exist, because without that, I think there seems to be this barrier in terms of then being able to commission training or being able to commission services or being able to meaningfully justify where there are limited resources, whether that's in the prison service or in probation services, that money can be sort of directed towards gambling harm. So until we can clearly kind of set out just what the scale and the severity of this challenge is within justice settings, I think it's very difficult then to drive any kind of services and funding behind that. In terms of how we capture prevalence, it's really tricky. I mean, we have regular conversations about, and prisons is another good example about how challenging it is, because people aren't necessarily recognizing some of what they're doing as necessarily being gambling. So traditional screening tools and some of the ways that we might try and ask a question broadly still fails to capture some of the people that we most need to get to. So again, I think it comes back to the need to be regularly and routinely asking the questions, but ready with a pathway that can be tailored towards people at the moment where they are identified and willing to perhaps come forward and engage with better support. So it's a bit of a cop out on the last one. I think there's more to be done, but I think that is a priority, and yeah, more thinking definitely around how we capture that.
Thank you both for the really comprehensive answers. Another practicality just from one of our attendees, they can't actually access the website and wonder if we can share a PDF. So I think that's possible, isn't it, Joe and Julie? Can we share a PDF with attendees after the brilliant? And so from the same questioner, really interesting question. Did you come up with any positive experiences of support? And is there a need to develop a community resolution pathway, and how might this look?
I'll do the positive bits. I think, yes, there were. Definitely. There were positive experiences of support throughout all the points of the of probation work. So with pre-sentence reports, some people had really lengthy full pre-sentence reports, and positive experiences of feeling that court staff were really interested and concerned. Probably a little less so in custody, but there was some positive experience around trying to make sure that people could access support if they were released on temporary license. And also in the community, again, really some positive experiences. But the thing that comes out is how inconsistent that was. It was very much kind of, you know, luck of the draw, to use a gambling analogy. It was just kind of happenstance if you happen to get a practitioner who had the time and the skills and the interest to create that positive experience. So we certainly don't want to present a kind of a consistently awful picture. That really wasn't the case. What we found was that the inconsistency is in itself the kind of problem.
Just perhaps pick up on the second part of that question, just around community resolutions. I think there certainly would be space for that, and I think the main reason that perhaps drives that is that, as I think both Liz and I alluded to, there was a real sense that often partners were being left to, in many respects, support the desistance work and the focus work in terms of gambling recovery, and also in terms of desistance ultimately from a further offence. And I think given that we know how gambling harms also affects relationships within the community and the risk and the flashpoints actually that gambling can create, particularly amongst a justice involved population, I think there could be quite a clear and I think it could be quite desirable to explore that. It's not going to work for everybody, and I think there would be risks involved with that, but I think there might also be some very positive steps forward, given that actually often people within the community are ultimately the ones that are providing some of that wider support, where probation services perhaps are less able, just as a blunt reality of not having time and resources that they might like.
Thank you both. I'm moving on to a methodological question now. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you carried out your thematic analysis?
Yep, so with both Liz and I spent far too many hours, I think, wading through. I personally prefer to use NVivo, and Liz prefers to painstakingly go through by hand. And what we did in a really kind of quite iterative process was going backwards and forwards, both with our lived experience advisory group, but also between one another, to just try and look at some of the emerging themes that came through from that data. But I have to say it was a lengthy process, wasn't it, Liz? And ultimately what we found was those overarching themes that come across the different settings. We were, by the end of the project, really quite comfortable that those were the overarching themes that we were finding in multiple different places. And actually, although we know that our sample of people on probation will be skewed to where there is a more closer link or obvious link between gambling and crime, and we know that some of our probation practitioner sample was skewed in the fact that frontline practitioners often did not have time or the desire to meet with us, we still, I feel, as a qualitative researcher, got the closest to saturation I think that I ever have done. And we were really hearing very, very similar and repeated themes across that quite large data set by the end.
Thank you. And another question, or rather a comment as well, that probably you might want to take offline, Julie and Liz, but Ryan Hines is from the Hold or Fold podcast from the National Prison Radio Association, and he said it'd be great to hear you speak about this on that podcast. So it's very, very insightful. And he also asks, he'd be interested to know how you could incorporate this into awareness workshops.
Liz, you want to?
I think definitely, well, for example, we have been given an opportunity to contribute to some of the training that ARA is going to be doing with probation practitioners in Wales. So I think if we could get more opportunities like that, then that would help us actually ensure that the research does have practical implications in terms of probation practice.
Fabulous, thank you. And I guess it'd be maybe you can be in touch offline about the podcast.
Yes, please.
Two more questions, and I think we're really running short of time now, so I'll try to get through these two quickly, and I think that's probably as much as we can fill in for this time. So one of our attendees says, I've been actively involved in gambling research with penal reform solutions inside of an establishment, and I've also taken part in this report, which is clearly showing devastating findings and clearly outlining what is needed to address the key issues. How can we ensure that a system will be put in place to prevent all harms? Very big question, but I wonder if you can have some insights into that answer.
I think there is some hope with the gambling levy coming in, and some of that levy going to Ministry of Justice and HMPPS. I think there will be opportunities in which to kind of get that more systematic awareness of gambling harms across the various points of the criminal justice system. It's, you know, it's a big piece of work and it's going to take many years, but there are the seeds of change in place, definitely. Julie, you were going to say something?
I was going to say it was an awfully big question for now 3 minutes, but it's a fantastic question. I want to echo everything Liz has just said. An important recommendation that we've made, I think, does reflect the value of lived experience, and I think lots of the good pockets of work that we're seeing are either practitioners who may or may not have disclosed kind of obviously lived experience, but are actually driving some work forward on the basis of having a kind of clearer insight, I think, to just how damaging gambling harms can be, and a whole range of other people who are much more actively involved in services. So I think that is part of it, but it is about trying to mobilize that in a kind of more consistent approach, so that, you know, somebody in London gets the same as somebody in the other side of London, and further and beyond across the country. So there is signs.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for just one final question. To what extent does the criminal justice system regard gambling as a lifestyle choice as opposed to an illness like drug or alcohol? And do barristers often discourage raising gambling harm as an issue for fear of it being regarded as not accepting responsibility and risking a longer sentence?
Again, I think this is one of the ones where there was considerable inconsistency. Some probation staff certainly did have that kind of cliched understanding of gambling harms or harmful gambling as being a choice, and that something people could stop if they just wished, if they applied their minds to it, and that it wasn't properly understood as an addictive behaviour, whereas other staff did have that more in-depth understanding. So in terms of extent, I'm not really sure, but we saw those inconsistencies between different levels of understanding of different members of staff. I can't remember what the second bit was, Vanessa.
I'll capture that. Just in relation to barristers, I mean, certainly it wasn't an explicit focus, but it inevitably came up in interviews. It's come up in previous studies, certainly that I've done, and no doubt Liz has also been involved with. Yes, people don't, you know, they often are being advised that, because barristers are saying to them, we just don't know how sentences, or for that matter, anybody else that might be making key decisions, are going to interpret this. So I think, again, it reflects that inconsistency that we're highlighting, where people don't know whether they might end up with actually a more punitive and a more lengthy sentence, rather than actually some understanding. So it does often feel quite haphazard and inconsistent for people, and certainly that is what some legal counsel have advised to reflect that.
Thank you both so much. And there were many comments in the chat also, thanking you both very much for the important work you've done and for presenting today, and very grateful to you for that. Hopefully everyone has seen the report in the chat, but we've also got in the chat about some information about our next hub event, which is in a month's time on December the 4th. I don't know if Sharon, did you want to say some final comments before we
I don't think so. No, just a massive thank you to Julie and Liz for both doing that research, which is, you know, such a substantive and important piece of work, and for sharing it with us today. From the questions and from the discussion, I know we all got a huge amount out of it, so thank you so much. As Vanessa said, our next hub event is an in-person one on the 4th of December. It's looking at the spatial dimensions of gambling. So if you're interested, do get in touch, or if you're signed up to our newsletter, you'll get information. But yeah, we're 1 minute past 1, so we'll bring it to a close there. But thank you, Julie and Liz and everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.